In 1386, a pig was dressed in human clothes and formally put on trial for the murder of a child in Normandy, France. No, this isn't fiction. This is a real example of medieval law. A bizarre world where animals could be brought to court and humans could be punished for wearing the wrong colour. Welcome, dear listeners, as we drift back through the mists of time to the strange and shadowy world of medieval Europe. Tonight we won't be marvelling at soaring castles or recounting tales of chivalrous knights. Instead, we're delving into the peculiar, bewildering realm of medieval law, a place where common sense often took a backseat to superstition and social control. The Middle Ages brought us illuminated manuscripts, magnificent cathedrals, and the beginnings of universities, but alongside these achievements came legal codes so outlandish they seem almost fictional to our modern minds. Before we begin our journey through these curious legal labyrinths, if you're enjoying these nocturnal narratives, consider subscribing and leaving a like. I'm always curious to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your location and local time. There's something comforting about knowing we're all connected across different time zones, drifting towards sleep together. Now, adjust your pillows, dim your lights, and perhaps let the gentle whir of a fan create that perfect background ambience as we step back in time together. Medieval law wasn't just a matter of justice, it was often a tapestry of the absurd. Picture yourself in a world where a pig could be dressed in human clothes and put on trial for murder, where the length of your beard might determine how much tax you owed, or where wearing a purple garment could lead to imprisonment if you weren't of noble birth. These weren't obscure regulations gathering dust in forgotten scrolls. They were the everyday rules that governed life from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the dawn of the Renaissance. Imagine a society where logic and faith intertwined in bewildering ways, where divine intervention was considered legitimate legal evidence, and where your social status dictated not just your opportunities but what fabrics you could legally wear. In the medieval mind, law wasn't simply about maintaining order, it was about preserving a divine hierarchy that stretched from the lowliest serf to the most powerful king, a reflection of heaven's own order on earth. Tonight we'll wander through this bewildering legal landscape where animals faced execution with all the ceremony of human criminals, where women could be punished for speaking too loudly, and where the accused might prove their innocence by grabbing red-hot iron or surviving being thrown into a lake. We'll discover how unmarried women sometimes enjoyed more freedoms than their wedded counterparts, why stealing a deer could be punished more severely than taking a human life, and the curious reason certain European rulers were so fixated on taxing facial hair. Each of these strange laws reveals something essential about medieval society, its deepest fears, its cherished values, its peculiar preoccupations. While they might seem ludicrous to our contemporary understanding to those living under them, these laws were deadly serious matters. Breaking them could result in crippling fines, public humiliation, grotesque physical punishment, or an agonizing death. So settle in beneath your blankets as we journey back to an era when the boundaries between law, religion, and folklore dissolved into a curious blend of the bizarre and sometimes cruel. A world where your birth determined nearly everything about your legal rights, where church and crown united to regulate even the most intimate aspects of human behaviour, and where justice often appeared in forms we would scarcely recognise today. This is the strange legal world of medieval Europe, where the laws themselves frequently instilled more fear than the crimes they were designed to prevent. Let's begin our journey with perhaps the most peculiar legal phenomenon of all, the medieval practice of putting animals on trial for their crimes. In the shadowy corridors of medieval justice, perhaps nothing seems more bewildering to our modern minds than the solemn spectacle of animals standing trial. Yes, you heard that correctly, not humans accused of crimes against animals, but actual animals themselves, dragged before judges and juries, appointed defence attorneys, and subjected to the full weight of medieval law. Pigs, cows, rats, even insects. The court was open to all of God's creatures, particularly if they'd been naughty. Now, before you dismiss this as some obscure practice that happened once or twice, let me assure you, animal trials were surprisingly common across Europe for hundreds of years. From the 13th to the 18th centuries, court records document over 200 formal animal trials, and those are just the ones important enough to write down. The real number was likely much higher. This wasn't some carnival sideshow. These were formal proceedings with all the gravity of human trials. Picture this scene in the French town of Falaise in 1386. A pig that had injured and killed a child was captured and imprisoned. Not slaughtered immediately, mind you, imprisoned. Then it was dressed in human clothes. Yes, someone had the job of putting pants on a pig and brought before the local court. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The pig, unsurprisingly, offered no defence, though in many animal trials a court-appointed lawyer would speak for the accused creature. The pig was found guilty and sentenced to public execution. But here's the truly strange part. The pig was first mutilated in the face and limbs, exactly mirroring the injuries it had inflicted on the child, before being hanged in the town square while dressed as a human. The execution was carried out by the public hangman, who was paid the same fee he'd receive for executing a person. They even commissioned a special scaffold for the occasion. This wasn't just mob justice or rural superstition. The trial followed proper legal procedure. There were educated judges, legal arguments, and an actual sentencing document that still exists today. Someone took the time to write, "The pig, having been found guilty of murder, shall be mangled in the head and forelegs and then hanged." An artist was even hired to permanently memorialise the hanging pig in a fresco that remained visible for centuries. But it wasn't just mammals that faced the stern hand of medieval justice. In the 16th century, the town of Autumn in France faced a serious beetle infestation. The beetles were destroying crops, which in a subsistence farming society could mean starvation. The townspeople didn't just reach for medieval pesticides, they filed a formal legal complaint against the beetles. The court appointed a prosecutor to make the case against the beetles and, in a show of surprising fairness, assigned the insects a defence attorney. This wasn't done in jest. The defence lawyer, a respected local legal scholar named Bartholomew Chassenet, took his job very seriously. When the beetles failed to appear in court after being summoned, shocking I know, Chassenet argued that the summons had been inadequate. The beetles, he claimed, were scattered across many parishes, and a single summons couldn't possibly reach them all. The judge, apparently finding this argument reasonable, agreed to a reissued summons announced from the pulpit of every local church. When the beetles still failed to show, Chassenet argued that his clients needed safe passage through areas populated by their natural predators. The case dragged on so long that the infestation naturally subsided, which was perhaps Chassenet's strategy all along. This seems absurd to us, but there was a certain logic at work. Medieval minds didn't see the sharp division between humans and animals that we do today. All creatures were part of God's ordered universe, subject to divine laws. If animals could sin, and many theologians believed they could, then they could be punished under human law, which was, after all, merely an extension of divine law. Some of the most elaborate animal trials involved pests like rats or locusts. In 1478, the rats of Autumn, apparently a hotspot for animal crime, were put on trial for destroying the barley crop. The court appointed a certain Barthélemy de Chasseneux to defend the furry culprits. In a brilliant legal manoeuvre, he argued that his clients couldn't possibly attend court because they feared for their lives. The townspeople's cats would surely attack them on their way to the proceedings. The judge remarkably found this argument persuasive. In another case, locusts in the Tyrol region were tried and actually excommunicated by the church, effectively banished from the community of Christian creatures and condemned to the spiritual wilderness. Ecclesiastical courts took these cases especially seriously, viewing pest infestations as potentially diabolical in origin. The trial transcripts show the courts wrestling with profound theological questions. Were these creatures acting on God's orders as punishment for human sin? If so, did humans have the right to interfere? The formal excommunication document would be read aloud to the fields where the insects swarmed, often accompanied by exorcism rituals and holy water. Imagine a solemn procession of priests and magistrates standing at the edge of a locust-infested field, reading out a formal condemnation to millions of bugs. If that doesn't capture the strange blend of the serious and the surreal in medieval life, I don't know what does. What's particularly fascinating is how meticulously fair these trials could be. Animals were not simply presumed guilty, they received due process. In 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets were tried for killing a 5-year-old boy. While the mother pig was condemned to death, her piglets were acquitted due to their youth and the bad influence of their mother. The court even considered evidence of the piglets' character, noting they were young and had shown no previous violent tendencies. Sometimes animals even won their cases. In 1587, a community in the French Alps brought a lawsuit against a species of grain-eating weevils. After hearing arguments from both sides, the judge ordered the townspeople to create special areas of land outside their fields where the weevils could eat without destroying crops. It was essentially a legally mandated nature reserve, a remarkably progressive solution that recognized the creature's right to exist. But not all animal trials ended with such leniency. A 1474 case in Basel, Switzerland saw a rooster put on trial for the crime of laying an egg. Yes, you heard that right. Male chickens don't lay eggs, so clearly this rooster was defying the natural order, a serious offence in medieval thinking. More troublingly, the court determined that roosters' eggs could hatch into basilisks or cockatrices, dangerous mythological creatures. The unlucky bird was found guilty of sorcery and burned at the stake along with its unnatural egg. Sometimes the line between human and animal punishment blurred uncomfortably. In some regions, animals that had been involved in acts of bestiality were killed alongside the human perpetrators, not as punishment for the animal, but to erase all memory of the transgression. In these troubling cases, the animal was viewed not as a criminal, but as property that had been irredeemably tainted. Why did this practice persist for so long? Partly because medieval people saw the world as deeply interconnected, a great chain of being linked humans, animals, and supernatural forces in a single moral universe. If God could punish humans for sin, then humans could punish animals for crimes. It was all part of maintaining cosmic order. There was also a deeply practical aspect. When a domestic animal killed someone, it created a theological problem. If animals were acting according to God's plan, why would God allow a child to be killed by a pig? Animal trials provided a way to restore order to a world thrown into chaos. By submitting the offence to legal procedure, the community symbolically reasserted control over the unpredictable natural world. The practice began to decline with the Enlightenment, as changing views of animals and nature made such trials seem increasingly irrational. The last formal animal trial probably occurred in 1906 in Switzerland, where a dog named Doozy was sentenced to death for killing a man. By then, the practice was already viewed as an anachronistic curiosity. As we lie here in the comfort of our modern world, where the line between human and animal is clearly drawn in our legal codes, it's worth considering what these strange trials tell us about our ancestors. They weren't simply being absurd or cruel. They were trying to make sense of a world where natural disasters, animal attacks, and pest infestations threatened their very survival. A world where justice needed to be visible, where order needed to be maintained, even if it meant putting a beetle on the witness stand or fitting a pig for a hanging noose. So the next time your pet misbehaves, be thankful you live in modern times. The worst your dog might face is the doghouse, not the courthouse. For medieval animals, crime definitely did not pay, and the justice system had a very literal interpretation of the concept that no creature was above the law. Now, let's move from furry criminals to fuzzy faces, as we explore how medieval rulers turned beards into a source of income through some of history's strangest taxes. As we drift from the curious courtrooms where animals face justice, let's turn our attention to something that grew a bit closer to home, literally on the faces of medieval men. Yes, tonight we're exploring one of history's most peculiar forms of taxation, the beard tax. While modern governments tax your income, property, and purchases, medieval rulers found a way to tax the very hair on your face. It seems that long before Instagram made beards trendy again, facial hair was already causing quite a stir in the corridors of power. Perhaps the most famous beard tax in history came from Peter the Great of Russia, though it's worth noting he ruled just after what we'd strictly consider the medieval period. Nevertheless, his aggressive facial hair policy was the culmination of centuries of beard regulations. When Peter returned from his European tour in 1698, he was determined to modernize Russia, and in his mind, modernization began at the chin. Beards to Peter represented everything old-fashioned and backward about Russia. European men were clean-shaven, and by God, Russians would be too. At a welcome home reception, Peter personally took out a razor and began shaving the beards off his horrified noblemen. Imagine that scene, the towering 6'7" Tsar wielding a razor like a weapon, while distinguished boyars trembled as their cherished facial hair fell to the floor. It wasn't just idle fashion advice, it was imperial policy enforced by the emperor's own hand. But Peter was practical enough to know he couldn't personally shave every bearded man in his vast empire. So he did what rulers often do when faced with widespread non-compliance: he taxed it. If you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay an annual tax that varied according to your social rank. Nobles paid 100 rubles, an enormous sum at the time. Merchants paid 60 rubles, common townspeople were charged 30. Peasants were spared the tax within their villages, but had to pay a kopeck, a small coin, every time they entered a city with their facial adornment. Upon payment, beard wearers received a copper token, a sort of beard license that had to be carried at all times. One side showed a beard and moustache with the words "money taken," while the reverse featured the imperial eagle and the year. Guards at city gates could demand to see these tokens, and those found with unlicensed facial hair could have their beards forcibly shaved on the spot. It was, quite literally, putting your money where your mouth is, or rather just below it. But Russia wasn't alone in its facial hair regulations. Centuries earlier, Henry VIII of England, himself the owner of a magnificent beard in his later years, imposed his own beard tax in 1535. The irony of a bearded monarch taxing beards was apparently lost on him, though his tax focused more on class distinction than Peter's modernising mission. Different ranks paid different amounts, creating a society where your beard literally displayed your wealth and status. King Henry's beard tax served a dual purpose. First, it filled royal coffers, which were perpetually emptied by his lavish lifestyle and military campaigns. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it reinforced the social hierarchy that Tudor society held so dear. A luxurious beard became a clear signal that you could afford the tax, an early form of conspicuous consumption displayed right on your face. The church got involved in beard regulations too. In medieval England, clergy were expected to be clean-shaven, a rule that caused considerable grumbling among the ranks. There are records of priests being disciplined for growing beards, with some claiming medical exemptions, insisting that their skin was too sensitive for shaving. The church authorities, apparently well versed in dermatological matters, would evaluate these claims with considerable skepticism. Medieval beard laws often reflected deeper cultural tensions. In 13th century Constantinople, when the city was briefly under Latin control, bearded Orthodox priests were particular targets of discrimination. Their traditional beards marked them as different from the clean-shaven Latin clergy, making facial hair a visible symbol of religious division. Some Orthodox priests reportedly had their beards forcibly shaved, an act considered not just humiliating but sacrilegious. Spain had its own complicated relationship with beards. During the Reconquista, as Christian kingdoms fought to reclaim territory from Muslim rulers, beards sometimes served as cultural and religious markers. Christians might adopt or abandon beard styles to distinguish themselves from Muslims, making facial hair a battleground of identity politics. At various times, laws emerged regulating who could wear what type of beard, another example of the body becoming a canvas for political and religious control. In some medieval Islamic regions, the opposite dynamic emerged. Taxes were occasionally levied on men who shaved their beards, as maintaining a beard was considered proper religious observance. The length, styling and maintenance of beards became subject to social regulation, if not always formal taxation. These beard taxes and regulations weren't just quirky historical footnotes, they often met with fierce resistance. For many men, particularly in Russia, beards held deep religious significance. The Orthodox Church taught that men should wear beards because they were created in God's image, and religious icons invariably depicted a bearded god. To force a Russian Orthodox believer to shave was to ask him to commit what he perceived as sacrilege. Many paid the tax not because they could afford it, but because their spiritual convictions demanded it. Some Russians, rather than pay or shave, fled to the forests or remote areas to keep their beards and their traditional way of life intact. Entire religious communities moved to the wilderness to preserve their bearded identity. When beard-wearing became an act of religious defiance, Peter's tax took on dimensions he likely hadn't anticipated. What began as a modernization effort became for some religious persecution. The physical token received upon paying the Russian beard tax deserves special mention. These copper beard badges have become prized collector's items today. Imagine the scene as a bearded merchant entered Moscow. At the city gate, a guard would stop him. "Your beard token, sir," the guard would demand. The merchant would pull out the small copper disc, proof that he had paid for the privilege of his facial hair. Satisfied, the guard would wave him through. It was a ritual repeated countless times across Russia, a daily reminder of the state's reach into the most personal aspects of appearance. The practicalities of beard taxation created their own bureaucratic headaches. How exactly does one define a beard? How long must facial hair be before it becomes taxable? What about moustaches without beards? These weren't just philosophical questions, but administrative challenges. Tax collectors needed clear guidelines, leading to some surprisingly specific definitions in official documents. In some regions, regulations specified exact measurements, turning tax collectors into reluctant facial hair measurers armed with rulers. The beard token system also created early examples of forgery. as clever artisans crafted counterfeit beard licenses. This led to periodic crackdowns and inspections, with unfortunate beard wearers finding themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the law when their tokens were revealed as fakes. What makes beard taxes particularly fascinating is how they reveal the extent to which rulers believed they had the right to regulate the most personal aspects of their subjects' appearance. Long before modern debates about bodily autonomy, medieval and early modern people were grappling with questions about whether the state could dictate what grew on your face. Beard taxes gradually faded away as Enlightenment ideas about individual liberty gained ground. Peter's beard tax was repealed in 1772, almost 50 years after his death. By then, European fashion had shifted again, with beards coming back into style, making the original rationale obsolete. Henry VIII's tax had long since disappeared, though class-based expectations about appearance persisted in more subtle forms. As you settle deeper into your pillow, perhaps running a thoughtful hand across your own chin, consider how fortunate we are to live in times when our facial hair choices are our own, free from royal interference and imperial taxation. Though perhaps, if you look at the price of high-end beard oils and specialty razors today, you might wonder if we've simply internalized the beard tax and now impose it on ourselves. With faces now suitably addressed, let's turn our attention to the rest of the medieval body, specifically what covered it. As it turns out, medieval lawmakers had plenty to say about your wardrobe choices, creating some of history's most elaborate dress codes through what were known as sumptuary laws. Now that we've explored the hairy taxation of medieval faces, let's drape ourselves in the equally bizarre world of medieval fashion police. Yes, long before fashion magazines told you what's hot and what's not, medieval governments were already dictating your wardrobe choices through what were known as sumptuary laws. And unlike modern fashion faux pas, which might earn you a raised eyebrow, breaking these clothing laws could land you in prison, relieve you of your precious garments, or empty your purse faster than a modern shopping spree. Sumptuary laws were, at their core, a way to ensure that you didn't dress above your social station. Heaven forbid a merchant's wife might be mistaken for nobility, or a craftsman be confused with a knight. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, your clothes were supposed to be an instant visual resume, telling everyone exactly where you belonged in the social pyramid. These laws weren't subtle suggestions, they were detailed dress codes enforced with remarkable zeal. Take England's 1363 Act of Apparel, particularly thorough attempt to regulate every thread on every body in the realm. It decreed that knights could wear cloth of gold and sable fur, while humble knights' wives were forbidden from wearing pearls except on their headdresses. Craftsmen and yeomen were prohibited from wearing gold, silver, embroidery, or precious stones. Their wives couldn't wear veils costing more than 12 pence. Labourers were stuck with blanket cloth and russet, essentially the medieval equivalent of wearing unfashionable basics from a discount store. Colour itself was regulated with surprising specificity. Purple, that rich, deep hue, was often reserved exclusively for royalty. The reason was purely economic. Purple dye was extraordinarily expensive, derived from thousands of tiny murex sea snails, each producing just a drop of the precious pigment. A single purple garment might require tens of thousands of snails, making it literally worth its weight in gold. Laws declaring purple a royal colour weren't just snobbery. They reflected the genuine economic reality that only a monarch could reasonably afford such extravagance. Similarly, certain furs were strictly regulated. In medieval England, ermine, that pristine white fur with black tips, was reserved for royalty and high nobility. Even wealthy merchants, no matter how rich they became, were forbidden from trimming their robes with this status symbol. Sable, almost as prestigious, was restricted to the upper echelons of society as well. Common folk had to make do with rabbit, fox, or sheep, perfectly warm but lacking the social cachet of the forbidden furs. The enforcement of these laws created some truly peculiar scenarios. Imagine town officials stopping people in the street to examine the fabric of their clothes, measuring the length of fashionable pointed shoes, which had their own specific regulations, or counting the pleats in a woman's headdress. There are records of clothing inspectors in Italian city-states who would literally cut forbidden decorations off garments on the spot if they found violations. Picture the humiliation of having your sleeves sliced away in the town square because they were a few inches longer than your station allowed. Venice took these laws particularly seriously. The city appointed official sumptuary magistrates who patrolled the streets and canals, keeping a watchful eye for any silks, jewels, or furs adorning the wrong social bodies. One Venetian law specifically forbade gondoliers from wearing colourful clothing, requiring them to dress in black, a regulation that eventually led to the tradition of black gondolas that persists to this day. What began as social control became a timeless aesthetic symbol of the city. Women's fashion faced especially strict regulation, reflecting deeper anxieties about female independence and sexuality. In many medieval towns, prostitutes were required to wear specific identifying features, yellow bands, red shoes, or striped hoods, to distinguish them from respectable women. Paradoxically, these same towns often passed laws preventing non-prostitutes from wearing excessively luxurious or revealing clothing, creating a bizarre situation where modest prostitutes might find themselves breaking the law by not looking promiscuous enough. The penalties for violating sumptuary laws could be surprisingly harsh. In some Italian cities, women caught wearing forbidden finery could be fined the equivalent of several months' wages. In extreme cases, the offending garments were confiscated, leaving the fashion criminal to find their way home in whatever remained. Men might face public humiliation, being displayed in the stocks while wearing their illegal attire, a medieval version of the fashion police perp walk. But for all their specificity and threatened punishments, sumptuary laws faced one persistent problem. People kept breaking them. Repeatedly, enthusiastically, creatively. The very existence of these laws and their frequent reissuance tells us they weren't particularly effective. Human vanity and the desire for social advancement proved stronger than legal prohibitions. Wealthy merchants and their wives were particularly persistent offenders. Having acquired the money to dress like nobility, they resented being unable to display their success. They found endless loopholes and workarounds. If a certain type of imported silk was forbidden, they'd find a slightly different weave that wasn't technically covered by the law. If gold embroidery was prohibited, they might use gilt thread that looked similar but fell outside the legal definition. It was a medieval arms race between lawmakers and fashion innovators. Sometimes the wealthy simply paid the fines as a cost of doing business, treating them as essentially a luxury tax. Records from Florence show certain wealthy families being fined repeatedly for the same clothing violations, suggesting they viewed the penalties as an acceptable price for social climbing through fashion. When a merchant could afford to pay a 50 florin fine for his wife's forbidden pearl necklace, the sumptuary law became less a prohibition and more a premium fee for entry into elite fashion circles. What makes sumptuary laws particularly fascinating is how they reveal the deep anxiety medieval authorities felt about social mobility. These weren't just arbitrary fashion rules. They were desperate attempts to maintain a visibly stratified society during periods when economic changes were blurring traditional boundaries. The rising merchant class, flush with cash from expanding trade networks, threatened the established order. If a merchant could dress like a duke, what did that say about the supposed natural hierarchy of society? Religious authorities supported these laws with theological arguments. Excessive luxury in dress was condemned as a form of pride, the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. Sermons warned that elaborate clothing not only violated human law, but divine order as well. Thomas Aquinas himself wrote that modest dress was a moral imperative, giving religious weight to what were essentially class-based restrictions. Not all sumptuary laws targeted the aspiring middle classes. Some were genuinely aimed at limiting extravagance among the nobility themselves. In times of economic hardship or war, rulers sometimes imposed austerity measures disguised as moral reforms. A 14th century English law limited nobles to 2 courses at meals and restricted them to a single pair of expensive shoes per year. These measures were framed as promoting modesty, but they had the practical effect of preventing aristocrats from bankrupting themselves through competitive displays of luxury. Perhaps the most peculiar aspect of medieval fashion law was the regulation of fabric length. The amount of cloth used in a garment, particularly in sleeves, trains, and decorative elements, was strictly controlled according to rank. A duke's wife might be permitted a train several yards long, while a baroness had to make do with a more modest trail behind her. Knights could wear moderately flowing sleeves, while merchants had to keep their arms contained in practical, less voluminous fabric. The result was that the highest-ranking people in society literally took up more physical space with their clothing, a tangible manifestation of their elevated status. These cloth restrictions had economic motivations as well. Fabric was expensive, representing a significant portion of a garment's cost. By limiting how much material could be used by each social rank, authorities were essentially controlling spending. It was wealth management through wardrobe regulation. The Black Death inadvertently created one of history's great sumptuary law loopholes. The devastating plague killed so many people that survivors across all classes suddenly inherited wealth from deceased relatives. With fewer people but the same amount of goods in circulation, even common folk could afford previously luxurious items. Enforcement of clothing laws temporarily collapsed in many regions, leading to what contemporary chroniclers described with horror as peasants dressing in the finery of their former masters. As the social order reasserted itself, new and more detailed sumptuary laws emerged, trying to close the plague-opened loopholes. Despite their ultimate ineffectiveness, sumptuary laws persisted well beyond the medieval period. Tudor England, Renaissance Italy, and colonial America all had their versions of these regulations. They only truly faded when Enlightenment ideas about individual rights began to challenge the notion that governments should police personal expression through clothing. As you drift closer to sleep, perhaps glancing at your own closet filled with clothes you've chosen freely, consider how fortunate we are to live in an age where your wardrobe is a matter of personal choice rather than legal requirement. Though fashion magazines and social media might create their own form of pressure about what to wear, at least there's no city official waiting to measure the length of your sleeves or count the pearls on your collar. Now, as we adjust our imaginary medieval garments to ensure they comply with our station, let's wander into the forests of medieval Europe, where another set of peculiar laws awaited anyone bold or hungry enough to hunt the king's deer. The punishment for venison, it turns out, could be far more severe than the penalty for murder. As we leave behind the world of regulated clothing, let's wander into the dappled light of medieval forests, where some of the harshest and most peculiar laws of the era awaited anyone desperate or daring enough to hunt the king's deer. These weren't just ordinary woodlands we're talking about. When medieval documents mention forests, they're referring to something very specific, designated royal hunting grounds, governed by their own special legal code, where the punishment for poaching could make murder seem like a minor offence by comparison. The concept of the royal forest emerged most famously in England after the Norman conquest of 1066. William the Conqueror, not content with seizing the entire country, decided to claim vast swaths of it as his personal hunting preserves. His son, William Rufus, expanded the system even further, famously declaring, "Whoso slays hart or hind shall be blinded." Yes, you heard that correctly. Take the king's deer, lose your eyes, not exactly a proportional punishment by modern standards. By the 13th century, approximately 1/3 of all England had been declared royal forest. But here's the truly bizarre part. These forests weren't necessarily wooded areas. The term referred to the legal status of the land, not its physical characteristics. Royal forest could include actual woodlands, but also open moors, heaths, farmland, and even entire villages. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your backyard had been declared a forest, and suddenly everything in it, from the deer to the rabbits to the very acorns falling from trees, belonged exclusively to a king you'd never even seen. Forest law created its own parallel legal system with specialised courts, judges and enforcement officers. The foresters were the frontline troops in this system, patrolling the boundaries, checking for signs of poaching and hauling suspects before forest courts. These weren't friendly park rangers, they were feared figures with broad powers to search, arrest, and even summarily punish those caught in minor infractions. Many supplemented their income by accepting bribes, essentially running a medieval protection racket among the trees. Above the foresters were various judicial officials. The verderers, usually drawn from local gentry, served as judges in forest courts. The regarders conducted regular inspections of forest boundaries. At the top of this green hierarchy sat the justice in eyre, a royal appointee who conducted periodic forest ayres, special judicial sessions dealing exclusively with forest offences. These forest ayres were dreaded events for local communities, as they often resulted in ruinous fines for individuals and entire villages. What made forest law particularly oppressive wasn't just its harsh penalties, but its extraordinarily broad scope. The crime of venison, a term referring not just to deer meat but to hunting any protected animals, was only one aspect. Equally important was vert, regulations protecting vegetation within the forest. Cutting down trees, collecting fallen branches without permission, clearing land, or allowing your animals to graze on forest vegetation could all result in severe punishment. The absurdity reached its peak with regulations about dogs. Anyone living within the forest boundaries had to put their dogs through a procedure called lawing or expeditation. This involved amputating 3 claws from each of the dog's front feet, or sometimes removing a large portion of the paw itself. The reasoning? A dog without claws couldn't effectively chase deer. This mutilation had to be performed on any dog large enough to pose a threat to game, regardless of whether the owner ever intended to hunt. Imagine being forced to cripple your beloved pet simply because you lived in an area the king had designated for his occasional hunting pleasure. The penalties for forest offences existed on a sliding scale of medieval unpleasantness. For minor infractions like gathering wood without permission, a fine might suffice. For poaching, especially repeat offences, punishments could include imprisonment, mutilation, or death. One particularly cruel option was binding to the deer. The poacher would be tied to the carcass of the deer he'd killed and forced to stand or lie with the rotting animal for days, a public humiliation that could also lead to serious illness. What's remarkable about these laws is how vastly they exceeded punishments for crimes against humans. In medieval England, a person who killed another human could often escape execution by paying a fine or claiming sanctuary in a church. Yet someone who killed the king's deer would face merciless punishment with few avenues for mercy. The message was clear. In the hierarchy of medieval values, royal property ranked higher than human life. These draconian forest laws gave rise to one of the most enduring figures in English folklore, Robin Hood. While historians debate whether any historical figure inspired the legend, the tales of an outlaw who poached royal deer and defied the corrupt enforcement of forest laws clearly resonated with medieval audiences. The ballads of Robin Hood stealing venison from the king's forests weren't just entertaining stories. They were fantasies of resistance against a legal system that criminalised basic survival for many rural people. Because that's the crucial context to understand. For many peasants living near royal forests, poaching wasn't sport or greed, but desperate necessity. When crops failed or winters grew harsh, the temptation of deer quietly grazing just beyond the village boundary became overwhelming. A single deer could feed a family for weeks, but it came with the risk of life-altering punishment. Imagine the terrible calculation. Risk blindness or death for pot of meat, or watch your children slowly starve. This was the reality for many living under the shadow of forest law. What's particularly striking is how arbitrarily these forests could be created or expanded. Kings could simply declare new areas to be royal forest with minimal justification. When Richard I needed money for his crusades, he expanded forest boundaries, knowing that more forest meant more opportunities to fine local communities for violations. King John was especially notorious for this practice, using forest law as a tool for political control and revenue generation. It was no coincidence that restrictions on the king's ability to create new forests was among the demands in Magna Carta in 1215, appearing alongside more famous clauses about trial by jury and freedom from arbitrary imprisonment. The enforcement of forest law gradually declined in later medieval periods, though it never disappeared entirely until modern times. The Charter of the Forest in 1217, a companion document to Magna Carta, provided some protections against the worst abuses. It guaranteed common access to certain resources and limited the king's ability to create new forests. Still, the fundamental injustice of the system was that wild animals belonged exclusively to the monarch regardless of whose land they wandered onto, persisted for centuries. The legacy of these laws lingered in unexpected ways. Modern conservation law, with its protected species and hunting seasons, evolved partly from these medieval precedents. Even the word forest itself, which we now use to describe any large wooded area, comes from this legal system rather than any ecological definition. When we talk about forest management today, we're using terminology that stems directly from medieval legal concepts about controlling nature for the benefit of the powerful. Forest laws weren't unique to England, though the English system was particularly well developed and documented. Similar regulations existed across Europe. In Germany, the term wildban described areas where only nobles had hunting rights. In France, garens or warrens were designated for royal or noble hunting. Throughout medieval Europe, the right to hunt was tied to social class, with harsh penalties for commoners who dared to claim wild game for themselves. The absurdity of these laws reached its peak in the concept of hedge breaking, the crime of damaging a hedge while pursuing game. Yes, in a world where violent assault might result in a simple fine, breaking a twig while chasing a rabbit could lead to imprisonment. The hedge, as property, was sometimes valued more highly than human bodily integrity. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps gazing out your window at trees that no monarch can claim, consider how profoundly our relationship with the natural world has changed. The deer and rabbits that medieval peasants risked death to hunt are, in many modern suburbs, garden pests that homeowners try to drive away. The forests that once represented oppression and forbidden bounty are now recreational spaces we visit for pleasure. The very concept that wild animals could be owned simply by royal declaration seems almost incomprehensible to our modern sensibilities. Yet perhaps some echo of that medieval belief still lingers when we debate who has the right to natural resources, who controls access to wilderness, and who benefits from the careful management or exploitation of the natural world. The specifics have changed, but the fundamental questions about power, ownership, and survival remain remarkably familiar. Now, let's leave the forest shadows behind and step into the even more restrictive world of medieval women, where an entire gender faced legal barriers that made forest laws seem almost reasonable by comparison. Married women, in medieval times, didn't just face social pressure. They lived in a world where their very existence was treated as a legal anomaly. If marriage was a fortress in medieval society, then being an unmarried woman was like standing outside its walls during a storm. Tonight, let's explore the curious, controlling, and often contradictory laws that governed women who, for whatever reason, weren't under a husband's authority. Ladies, if you're listening while your husband snores beside you, count yourself lucky, at least by medieval standards, because back then, the moment a woman said, "I do," she essentially ceased to exist as a legal person. The doctrine of coverture, a legal principle that spread across Europe, meant that a wife's legal identity was subsumed or covered by her husband's. No property rights, no contract rights, no legal standing. Her identity dissolved into his like sugar in hot tea. But what about women who never married? Or widows? This is where things get interesting. In medieval legal terms, these women were femmes seules, women alone. And while that might sound like freedom, it came with its own special set of restrictions and occasional odd privileges that varied wildly across Europe. In medieval England, an unmarried woman could technically own property, sign contracts, and run businesses. Some widows inherited their husbands' trades and became quite successful. Records show female brewers, silk weavers, and even blacksmiths operating independently. In London, the Silk Women's Guild consisted largely of unmarried women or widows who controlled significant portions of the luxury textile trade. Sounds progressive, doesn't it? Well, hold your horses. The same societies that allowed these small freedoms also created elaborate systems to control, tax, and ultimately pressure women into marriage. Let's take a deep breath as we explore some of the stranger laws that targeted women without husbands. In many European towns, unmarried women above a certain age, usually around 25, ancient by medieval standards, had to pay special taxes. These weren't subtle nudges. They were financial penalties for not fulfilling what was seen as a woman's primary duty, becoming a wife and mother. In some parts of Germany, this was called the Hagestolzenrecht, or bachelor tax, but it fell disproportionately on women. In parts of France, it was known as le droit de célibat and required annual payment to the local lord. Now imagine being a widow in medieval Normandy. The moment your husband died, a clock started ticking. You had exactly 40 days to decide whether to accept your dower rights, the portion of your husband's estate guaranteed to you, or reject them in favour of your dowry, what you'd brought into the marriage. Make the wrong choice, and poverty awaited. Oh, and during those 40 days of mourning and life-altering financial decisions, you were expected to remain in the marital bed day and night, as if keeping it warm for your departed husband's ghost. Perhaps the most visually strange laws involved the public identification of unmarried women. Across various regions and times, unmarried women were legally required to wear specific colours, headgear, or badges that announced their status to the entire community. In parts of Germany, unmarried women had to wear plain caps, rather than the more elaborate headdresses of married women. In some Italian city-states, prostitutes and unmarried women were sometimes grouped under similar regulations, forced to wear bells or yellow badges, a cruel association meant to pressure women toward marriage. The legal tools for controlling difficult unmarried women were particularly creative and cruel. Take the scold's bridle, for instance. This iron contraption was literally locked around a woman's head with a piece of metal that pressed down on her tongue. Its purpose? To silence women deemed too outspoken, argumentative, or independent, characteristics often associated with unmarried women who weren't under male control. Court records from 15th century England show that unmarried women were 3 times more likely to be subjected to the bridle than their married counterparts. Then there was the cucking or ducking stool. Picture a chair attached to a long wooden beam, positioned over a body of water. The difficult woman was strapped to the chair and repeatedly dunked into the water, sometimes clean, often not. While this punishment wasn't exclusively for unmarried women, they were frequent targets, especially those who spoke out against local authorities or lived in ways deemed inappropriate. Some towns took control to extremes. In parts of medieval Germany, unmarried women couldn't inherit property unless they committed to never marrying. The moment they took a husband, any inherited property would revert to male relatives. It was a legal trap. Choose financial security or companionship, but you can't have both. What about female autonomy in the spiritual realm? Surely the church offered some refuge. Well, yes and no. Convents did provide an alternative path for women who didn't wish to marry. A woman who took religious vows gained a sort of parallel legal status. Not quite a femme sole, not a wife, but something with its own rules and hierarchies. However, by the late medieval period, many regions required hefty entrance donations to convents, effectively closing this option to all but the wealthy. And here's where the contradictions of medieval law get truly bewildering. In some situations, unmarried women had more rights than their married sisters. A femme sole could sign contracts and run businesses. In late medieval London, records show that approximately 30% of craft shop owners were unmarried women or widows. Meanwhile, a married woman couldn't even testify in court without her husband's permission in many jurisdictions. These contradictions reflected the fundamental anxiety about female independence. Society needed unmarried women. They served as caretakers, midwives, nurses, and filled crucial economic roles. Yet their very existence outside male control was seen as threatening to the social order. The laws grew even stranger when it came to widows who refused to remarry. In some regions, widows who remained unmarried for more than 2 years faced increasing tax burdens. In parts of France, a widow who hadn't remarried could be required to host soldiers in her home, a financial and often physical risk. The message was clear. A woman without a husband was a problem that needed solving. Let's talk about inheritance, where the legal absurdities reached new heights. In many places, an unmarried woman had more inheritance rights than her married sister. She could own and manage property independently. But those rights came with severe limitations. In 14th century Burgundy, unmarried women could inherit land but couldn't sell it without permission from male relatives. They owned it but didn't really control it. The most extreme legal restraints came for women who remained unmarried by choice rather than circumstance. These women sometimes faced accusations of being unnatural. In some communities, they were barred from certain festivals and celebrations. In parts of rural England, an unmarried woman past childbearing age might be prohibited from attending births or being present at weddings. Systematic exclusion from female community rituals. What's truly fascinating is how some women navigated these restrictions with remarkable creativity. Take the Beguines of the Low Countries, communities of women who lived together religiously but took no formal vows. They existed in a legal grey area, neither married nor nuns, and managed to create spaces of relative independence within the constraints of medieval society. Naturally, they faced periodic persecution and attempts to regulate their communities. There were also marriage sabbaticals, legal arrangements in some merchant towns where a husband would grant his wife temporary status as a femme sole while he travelled for trade. During these periods, women could legally operate businesses, sign contracts, and even appear in court. Once the husband returned, these rights disappeared. It was independence with an expiration date. As we drift towards sleep, imagine living in this contradictory legal landscape where your very status as an independent woman marked you as both necessary and suspicious. The laws surrounding unmarried women weren't just about control. They revealed deep social anxieties about female power and autonomy. And as we transition to our next topic, remember that while unmarried women faced these strange legal restrictions, all people in medieval times lived under the shadow of perhaps the most peculiar legal system of all, trial by ordeal. Because when human judgment wasn't enough, medieval courts turned to divine intervention through fire, water, and combat. But that's a story that'll have to wait until your eyelids grow a little heavier and the night a little deeper. When medieval courts faced difficult cases with limited evidence, they didn't call forensic experts or analyze DNA. They turned to God. Trial by ordeal represents perhaps the strangest intersection of law, religion, and physical suffering in human history. As you settle deeper into your pillow, let's explore a legal system where innocence wasn't proven by evidence, but by surviving horrific tests of endurance that supposedly reveal divine judgment. Imagine you're accused of stealing your neighbour's prized cow. You deny it vehemently, but it's your word against theirs. Today, without evidence, the case might be dismissed. In medieval Europe, however, you might find yourself standing before a priest, preparing to plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water. Welcome to trial by ordeal, where your innocence wasn't in the hands of a jury, but supposedly in the hands of God himself. The logic behind these trials, if we can call it that, was deceptively simple. God, being omniscient and just, wouldn't allow an innocent person to suffer unduly. Therefore, if you survived the ordeal relatively unscathed, God had intervened to protect you, proving your innocence. If you failed, well, clearly divine judgment had found you wanting. It was justice outsourced to the supernatural. Let's take a deep breath and explore the most common ordeals, each more wince-inducing than the last. Trial by hot iron was particularly popular across Europe from the 9th through the 13th centuries. The accused would carry a red-hot iron bar for a specific distance, usually 9 feet. Afterward, their hand would be bandaged and examined 3 days later. Clean wounds meant innocence. Infection meant guilt. The church would oversee the entire process, blessing the iron and interpreting the results. In some variations, the iron took different forms. In Anglo-Saxon England, there was the single ordeal with a 1-pound iron, and for more serious cases, the triple ordeal with a 3-pound iron. Imagine the terror of waiting those 3 days, knowing your fate rested not just on divine intervention, but on how quickly your body could heal. Trial by hot water or the cauldron followed similar principles. The accused would plunge a hand, sometimes up to the elbow, into boiling water to retrieve a stone or ring. Again, the wounds would be bandaged and examined days later. In some regions, the depth of the water corresponded to the severity of the crime. Wrist deep for minor offences, elbow deep for major ones. Perhaps the most famous ordeal was trial by cold water, often associated with witch trials, though it predated them by centuries. The accused would be bound with ropes and lowered into a body of water that had been blessed by priests. The counterintuitive outcome here was that sinking was good. It meant the pure water accepted you, proving innocence. Floating meant rejection by the sacred element, and thus guilt. Of course, if you were innocent and sank, they were supposed to pull you out before you drowned. Supposed to. There's a disturbing logic here. Many accused witches were elderly women who, due to age and often malnutrition, had less body fat and would sink more readily than healthier individuals. Meanwhile, the terror of the ordeal might cause others to gasp and hold air, making them more buoyant. The test was literally stacked against the healthy and terrified. For the nobility, there was a more dignified option: trial by combat or wager of battle. Here, divine judgment would manifest through victory in armed combat. The accused could fight personally or hire a champion, a medieval legal loophole that favoured the wealthy who could afford skilled fighters. The combat would continue until one party surrendered or died, with the victor declared innocent by divine favour. Women, children, the elderly, and the clergy were generally excused from personal combat, but this created its own problems. If you couldn't fight and couldn't afford a champion, you might be forced into one of the more physical ordeals instead. Then there were the more obscure ordeals. Trial by bread and cheese, known as the korsned, involved the accused attempting to swallow a piece of bread and cheese that had been blessed by a priest. If you choked or couldn't swallow, perhaps due to the terror-induced dry mouth, you were guilty. Imagine determining someone's fate based on their ability to swallow while terrified. The cross ordeal required both the accused and accuser to stand with their arms outstretched like a cross. Whoever lowered their arms first lost the case. It was essentially a test of endurance, with divine intervention supposedly strengthening the righteous party's muscles. Perhaps most bizarre was the beer rite, used when a murderer was unknown. Suspects would approach the victim's body and touch it. If the corpse bled anew, started to foam at the mouth, or showed other changes, the person touching it was deemed guilty. This macabre practice relied on the belief that a murder victim's body would react in the presence of their killer, an early, deeply superstitious precursor to the modern lie detector. Now you might be wondering, did people actually survive these ordeals? Surprisingly, yes, and perhaps more often than you'd think. Historical records suggest that many accused persons were declared innocent after undergoing these trials. In fact, some historians estimate that the survival rate for some ordeals might have been as high as 50–80%. This unexpected leniency points to something fascinating about the ordeal system. Some scholars believe that many priests who administered these tests may have subtly manipulated the outcomes. The iron might not be fully heated, the water not truly boiling, or the bandaging particularly careful to promote healing. These clerics weren't necessarily undermining the system. They might have genuinely believed that God worked through their actions to protect the innocent. The preparation for an ordeal was elaborate and psychologically significant. The accused would fast, pray, attend Mass, and confess their sins for 3 days before the trial. This spiritual preparation served both religious purposes and practical ones. A truly guilty person might confess rather than face divine judgment, eliminating the need for the ordeal entirely. By the 13th century, this system began to unravel. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 banned clergy participation in ordeals, effectively removing the divine sanction that gave them legitimacy. Without priests to bless the water or iron, to interpret the results as divine judgment, the practice began to fade. This created a vacuum in the legal system that helped spur the development of trial by jury and the increased use of torture to extract confessions, not necessarily an improvement for the accused. What's truly fascinating about trial by ordeal is not just its strangeness, but what it reveals about medieval worldviews. This wasn't simply a cruel system, though it certainly was that, but a reflection of a society that saw the divine as actively intervening in daily affairs, where the natural and supernatural weren't separate realms but constantly interacting. The ordeal system also shows us something about human nature across time. When faced with uncertainty, we create systems that provide clarity, even if that clarity is built on questionable foundations. The medieval person facing an ordeal and the modern person awaiting a jury verdict share the same fundamental human experience: the terrifying uncertainty of having your fate in others' hands. Regional variations added further complexity to these trials. In Scandinavia, the ordeal might involve walking on hot ploughshares. In parts of Eastern Europe, the accused might have to retrieve an object from a narrow chimney filled with smoke. In each case, local customs shaped how divine judgment was supposedly revealed. There were also social dimensions to consider. While ordeals were theoretically available to all classes, in practice the wealthy could often avoid them through compurgation, essentially gathering a sufficient number of character witnesses to swear to their good character. Only when this failed would nobles face physical ordeals, and even then, they usually had the option of trial by combat or hiring champions. For women, the ordeal system held particular terrors. They were more likely to face cold water ordeals, which, as we've discussed, could be manipulated more easily against them. Women accused of adultery in some regions faced the ordeal of the bitter waters, where they would drink a concoction prepared by priests. Illness following consumption indicated guilt, though the psychological stress alone could easily induce physical symptoms. As our eyelids grow heavier, consider one final fascinating dimension of the ordeal system: its psychological effects. These trials weren't just physical tests, but spiritual and mental ones. The guilty might betray themselves through fear or confession. The preparation period, days of fasting, prayer, and contemplation, created an atmosphere where truth might emerge without the ordeal ever occurring. In a world without forensic science, without complex legal precedent, without reliable witnesses, the ordeal system provided answers, however flawed. It gave communities closure. It gave the accused a chance, however painful, to be cleansed of suspicion. And perhaps most importantly for medieval minds, it placed justice in the hands of the ultimate authority, not fallible human judges, but divine judgment itself. As we drift towards sleep, imagine standing before that cauldron of boiling water, your community watching, your fate hanging in the balance, the terror, the faith, the hope for divine intervention. The ordeal system may seem brutally primitive to our modern sensibilities, but for medieval people it represented something profound: the belief that truth would always emerge, that justice was not merely human, but cosmic. And now, as we leave behind the hot irons and blessed waters of the ordeal system, let's turn our thoughts to another dark corner of medieval law: witchcraft accusations. For while trial by ordeal eventually faded from European courtrooms, it was replaced by something perhaps even more insidious: systematic persecution justified by fear of the supernatural. But that's a story for another moment, as your breathing deepens and sleep draws closer. The medieval mind lived in a world where the supernatural wasn't just possible, it was ever present. angels and demons lurked in shadows, miracles and curses shaped daily life, and the boundary between natural and supernatural was thin as gossamer. In this reality, the witch wasn't a Halloween costume or fairy tale character, but a terrifying possibility living next door. Let's drift into the darkest corner of medieval law, the evolution and application of witchcraft legislation, where fear became policy and suspicion became death. Contrary to popular belief, early medieval authorities were actually skeptical about witchcraft. The Church's official position, established in the Canon Episcopi around 900 CE, dismissed witches' sabbaths and magical flights as delusions. In fact, for centuries it was considered heretical to believe too firmly in witchcraft. The true sin was believing that humans could possess supernatural powers that belonged only to God. This relative skepticism began to shift dramatically in the late medieval period. By the 14th and 15th centuries, theological opinion reversed. Witchcraft transformed from superstitious nonsense into a horrifying reality, a diabolic conspiracy against Christendom itself. This shift birthed one of history's darkest legal legacies. The witchcraft laws that emerged varied widely across Europe. In England, witchcraft was initially treated primarily as a civil offence, with the Witchcraft Act of 1542 making it a felony punishable by death, but only when alleged witchcraft caused physical harm. Simple divination or love magic received lesser punishments. Meanwhile, in parts of Germany and Switzerland, witchcraft became associated with heresy and the emerging concept of diabolical conspiracy, making it an exceptional crime deserving exceptional measures. Perhaps the most chilling legal innovation was the classification of witchcraft as crimen exceptum, an exceptional crime that justified exceptional legal procedures. Because witches supposedly operated in secret with the devil's help, normal standards of evidence were considered insufficient. Hearsay, admissible, anonymous accusations, perfectly acceptable, the testimony of children, criminals, or the legally incompetent, valuable evidence when it came to witchcraft. And then there was torture, legally sanctioned and methodically applied. While regular crimes had restrictions on its use, witchcraft investigations often received exemptions. After all, how else could you combat the devil's power of silence he supposedly bestowed on his followers? The legal logic created perfect storm conditions. Once accused, escape became nearly impossible. The procedures for identifying witches reveal medieval law at its most creative and cruel. The swimming test we discussed earlier took on new significance in witch trials. Suspected witch would be bound and lowered into blessed water. Floating indicated guilt, sinking innocence, though the innocent would hopefully be retrieved before drowning. The test created a perfect catch-22. Survival suggested guilt, while proving innocence might cost your life. Then there was pricking, the methodical search for insensitive spots on the accused's body. Witch prickers, specialised officials in some regions, would systematically insert pins into the suspect's flesh. A spot that didn't bleed or cause pain was declared a witch's mark, evidence of the devil's touch. Unscrupulous prickers sometimes used retractable pins or specially dulled needles to ensure the right outcome. For female suspects, the humiliation went deeper. They would be publicly stripped and shaved, not just head hair, but all body hair, while examiners searched for any unusual marks, moles or skin tags that might be teats for suckling demonic familiars. These examinations happened before jeering crowds, breaking the accused's spirit before the trial proper even began. The most insidious witch-finding technique was the watching. Suspects were kept awake for days, denied food and water, and observed constantly. Sleep deprivation eventually produced hallucinations and confusion that interrogators interpreted as demonic influence or confession. Some were forced to sit on witch chairs, seats covered in spikes that prevented rest without causing fatal wounds. Imagine days without sleep, in constant pain, waiting for a trial where floating or sinking in water determined your fate. The mechanics of witch trials varied by region, creating a patchwork of horror across Europe. In areas following Roman law traditions, like France and Italy, the inquisitorial procedure dominated, judges actively investigated, questioned witnesses, and determined outcomes. In contrast, England maintained a more adversarial system, with accusers bringing charges and presenting evidence, offering marginally better chances for the accused. What truly transformed witch persecution from isolated incidents into systematic campaigns was the publication of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, in 1487. Written by Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this text wasn't just another theological treatise. It was a comprehensive witch-hunting manual that detailed identification, interrogation, and prosecution procedures. Though never officially endorsed by the Church, its influence spread like wildfire across Europe, giving local authorities a ready-made template for witch-finding. The Malleus introduced or reinforced several dangerous ideas: that witchcraft was primarily a female crime, though men were certainly accused too; that skepticism about witchcraft was itself suspicious, and that confessions extracted under torture were reliable evidence. Perhaps most destructively, it portrayed witches not as individual malefactors, but as members of a vast satanic conspiracy, turning each trial into a search for accomplices and confederates. One accusation could, and often did, spark dozens more. Most disturbing was how witch trials distributed suffering unevenly across society. Though no one was entirely safe, certain groups faced exponentially higher risks. Women comprised approximately 75 and 85% of those executed for witchcraft across Europe, with percentages even higher in some regions. Age created another vulnerability. Around half of accused witches were over 50, at a time when reaching that age was relatively uncommon. Economic marginality played a role too. Many defendants were widows or single women living precariously on society's edges. The gender imbalance wasn't accidental. The Malleus explicitly claimed women were more susceptible to demonic influence, stating they were more carnal than man and intellectually like children. The very word femina, woman, was etymologized as fee, faith, and minus, less, literally lesser faith. When combined with property concerns, accused widows' lands often reverted to male relatives or the state, we glimpse how supernatural fears conveniently aligned with worldly interests. Local dynamics dramatically affected how witch laws operated. The worst outbreaks often occurred where central authority was weakest and local courts strongest. The infamous Bamberg and Würzburg trials in 1620s Germany, where approximately 1,000 people died, happened in politically fragmented territories during the chaos of the 30 Years' War. Without superior courts to check excesses, local panics blazed uncontrolled. Economic factors intertwined with witchcraft accusations in complex ways. Some regions allowed confiscated property to pay for trial expenses, creating perverse incentives for officials. In Salem, Massachusetts, though outside our medieval focus, many accusations fell along property dispute lines. In the German prince-bishoprics, prosecutions sometimes served to replenish war-depleted treasuries. Fear of witches was genuine, but worldly concerns shaped how that fear manifested legally. The decline of witch trials came gradually and unevenly. By the late 17th century, growing skepticism among educated elites, concerns about judicial excesses, and changes in religious thought began undermining the legal foundations of witch hunting. The last execution for witchcraft in England occurred in 1684, though trials continued elsewhere. Scotland saw its last legal witch execution in 1727, while Switzerland's final witch trial ended with an execution in 1782. What's particularly fascinating is how legal reforms ultimately ended what legal innovations had begun. Courts increasingly rejected spectral evidence, demanded material proof, and applied standard rules of evidence to witchcraft cases. The same legal systems that had created exceptional procedures for hunting witches eventually dismantled them in the name of rationality and consistency. Looking back at witchcraft laws from our modern perspective, it's easy to dismiss them as superstitious barbarism. Yet these laws emerged from educated minds in sophisticated legal systems. They reflected not simply ignorance, but coherent worldviews where witchcraft represented an existential threat to both eternal salvation and social order. The judges who sentenced witches weren't cackling villains. They were sincere men genuinely trying to protect their communities from what they perceived as diabolic infiltration. This doesn't excuse the suffering these laws caused, but it should give us pause. Every era has its unquestioned assumptions, its blind spots, its definitions of existential threat that justify exceptional measures. What legal excesses might future generations judge in our own time? As your eyelids grow heavier, consider one final thought. The witch trials represent a perfect storm where law, religion, gender, politics, and economics created a self-reinforcing system that consumed thousands of lives. They remind us that legal systems, however elaborate, remain human creations reflecting human fears. And as we leave behind the darkened courts where witches face their accusers, Let's turn to something more mundane, but no less revealing of medieval society: the surprisingly complex regulations governing human waste. Because even the most basic bodily functions didn't escape medieval legislation's reach. But that exploration will have to wait until you've settled deeper into your pillow, letting the rhythm of these words carry you toward dreams. If there's one universal human experience that transcends time, culture, and social status, it's the need to answer nature's call. Yet how societies handle this most basic bodily function reveals volumes about their values, technology, and social organization. So as you settle deeper into your blankets, let's explore the surprisingly extensive legal framework that governed medieval waste management, a topic both mundane and fascinating that takes us from castle guardraobes to city streets awash with the remnants of daily life. Medieval cities had a waste problem of monumental proportions. Lacking modern sewage systems, they struggled with the daily elimination of human waste, food scraps, animal dung, craft byproducts, and general rubbish. The smell of a medieval city on a hot summer day would likely render most modern visitors unconscious. Yet within this malodorous reality, communities developed intricate legal codes to manage the inevitable mess. Let's start with the infamous cry of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water. This French phrase, corrupted in English to "gardez-l'eau," wasn't just a colourful expression. It was a legal requirement in many medieval towns. Before emptying chamber pots from upper windows onto the streets below, residents were legally obligated to shout this warning, giving pedestrians a fighting chance to dodge the incoming shower. In Edinburgh, local ordinances specified that waste could only be thrown between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., and only after 3 distinct warnings had been called. Failure to provide these warnings could result in fines that varied by location and the unfortunate victim's social status. If you doused a common labourer in 14th century London, you might escape with a small fine. Soak a nobleman in your night soil, and you could face a penalty equal to a month's wages or more. In some jurisdictions, repeat offenders might find themselves sitting in the stocks, possibly being pelted with the very substances they had failed to announce. But medieval sanitation laws went far beyond window-tossing etiquette. Many towns appointed official muck rakers, or gong farmers, early waste management professionals charged with clearing public areas of excrement. These officials operated under strict regulations about when and where they could dump their malodorous collections. In London, the rakers were permitted to dispose of waste in the River Thames, but only at specific locations and during ebbing tides, ensuring the current carried the waste seaward rather than back into the city. Cities near rivers often had the strictest regulations. In medieval Paris, the Seine was both drinking water source and waste disposal site, a dangerous combination that authorities attempted to manage through zoning. Ordinances from the 13th century show designated areas for waste disposal downstream from drinking water collection points, with substantial fines for those who dumped waste in restricted areas. Did these laws prevent contamination? Not really, but they represent early attempts at public health management long before germ theory was understood. Public latrines existed in many medieval cities, particularly in monasteries, castles, and larger towns. These facilities weren't the private cubicles we're accustomed to today, but often open benches with multiple seats arranged side by side, defecation as a social activity. Regulations governed their maintenance, cleaning schedules, and even user fees in some locations. In London, public privies known as common jakes were subject to inspection by ward officials, with fines levied against their operators if they became too foul. One of the most interesting legal concepts involved the responsibility for cleaning areas where private and public spaces met. Most towns operated under variations of the frontage rule, the principle that property owners were legally responsible for cleaning the street in front of their homes or businesses, typically extending to the middle of the road. In York, homeowners were required to clean their frontage 3 times weekly, with special cleaning mandates before religious festivals. Similar laws existed across Europe in essentially privatising public sanitation through mandated citizen participation. The medieval privy presented its own legal complications, particularly when shared between properties. Party wall privies serving multiple houses generated endless disputes over cleaning responsibilities and maintenance costs. Local court records from towns across Europe overflow with lawsuits about overflowing cesspits, collapsing privy structures, and neighbours who failed to contribute their share to cleaning expenses. One particularly detailed case from 15th century Norwich records a 3-year legal battle between neighbours over a shared cesspit that had contaminated a cellar. Medieval property law at its most aromatic. Castle and monastery designers incorporated surprising sophistication into their waste management systems. Many castles featured garderobes, toilet chambers built into the thickness of exterior walls, dropping waste directly outside. These structures generated regulatory challenges of their own. Castle garderobes that emptied into moats required periodic cleaning to prevent disease and stench, with detailed records showing payment schedules for the unfortunate workers assigned this task. Some castle regulations required garderobe chutes to be closed during enemy sieges, preventing attackers from using these openings to gain entry. Security concerns trumping comfort. For the wealthy, private solutions offered escape from public filth. Rich urban households maintained private cesspits beneath their homes, which required periodic emptying by the specialists known variously as gong farmers, night soil men, or more bluntly as shit shovelers. These workers operated under strict regulations regarding when they could transport waste through city streets, typically at night, hence night soil, and where they could dispose of their collection. Many cities required these workers to register with authorities and barred them from certain public places due to their perpetual stench. The disposal of animal waste generated its own regulatory framework. In an era when horses, cows, pigs, and chickens shared urban spaces with humans, animal excrement was an overwhelming presence. Medieval London had specific ordinances forbidding pig owners from allowing their animals to roam freely and soil the streets, with fines and potential confiscation for repeat offenders. Butchers faced particularly strict regulations, as blood and offal from slaughterhouses could quickly create public health hazards. Many towns required butchers to operate in designated areas, often near flowing water, with detailed rules about disposing of unusable animal parts. The regulation of human waste inevitably reflected social hierarchies. In stratified medieval society, waste management law differed dramatically between rich and poor districts. Wealthy neighbourhoods often enjoyed more frequent street cleaning, better enforcement of sanitation ordinances, and priority attention from public officials. Meanwhile, poor districts suffered under the same regulations but with minimal enforcement, creating festering conditions that contributed to the rapid spread of disease when epidemics struck. This disparity became painfully apparent during outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases. Faced with catastrophic mortality, authorities often enacted emergency sanitation laws requiring extraordinary cleaning efforts, waste removal, and even the burning of contaminated materials. These crisis regulations temporarily disrupted normal social boundaries, as even wealthy districts faced mandatory inspections and cleaning orders backed by severe penalties. The Black Death of the 14th century prompted sanitation legislation across Europe that, in some places, formed the foundation of public health law for centuries to come. Despite their best legal efforts, medieval cities remained places where waste management was, at best, marginally effective. The combination of limited scientific understanding, inadequate technology, and sheer population density created challenges that no legal system could fully address. Yet the elaborate regulations developed during this period reveal a society deeply concerned with managing shared spaces and mitigating the worst impacts of communal living. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of medieval bathroom laws is how they shaped urban development. Many European cities still bear the imprint of these early regulations in their street layouts, property boundaries, and water management systems. The medieval frontage rule, for instance, established patterns of responsibility for public space that continue in modified form in many municipalities today. As your eyelids grow heavy, consider how these seemingly mundane regulations about the most basic human functions reveal the complexities of medieval social organisation. From the humble chamber pot to elaborate castle garderobes, from public privies to private cesspits, the management of waste required communities to develop shared expectations and enforceable standards. And as we leave behind the malodorous streets of medieval cities, we turn our attention to another area where law intruded into private life with surprising detail and frequency: the regulation of marriage and sexuality, because medieval authorities were just as concerned with what happened in the bedchamber as what happened afterward in the chamber pot. But that's a story for when you've drifted even closer to sleep, wrapped in the comfortable knowledge that at least you don't need to shout Garde-lo before flushing your modern toilet. And tonight, as we continue our whispered journey through the fog-laden paths of medieval law, let's turn to perhaps the most intimate aspect of human existence: marriage and sexuality. The medieval world didn't just regulate commerce, crime, and clothing. No, it reached right into the bedchamber, with laws so peculiar and invasive they might keep you awake if they weren't delivered in this gentle, drowsy tone. Marriage in medieval Europe wasn't primarily about love or personal choice. It was a sacrament, yes, but also a contract, a political tool, and a means of controlling property and lineage. The church held the reins tightly, establishing itself as the ultimate authority on who could marry whom, when and how. But the rules they created would strike us today as bizarrely specific and often uncomfortably public. Let's begin with consent, which might seem like a modern concept, but surprisingly existed in medieval canon law. By the 12th century, the church had established that mutual consent was necessary for a valid marriage. However, this didn't mean what we might think today. For noble families, marriages were arranged with political and economic advantages in mind, with children sometimes betrothed as young as 7 years old. Technically, both parties needed to consent when they reached the age of majority, 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But imagine the pressure when your entire family's alliance strategy depended on your quiet "I do." What's strange to our modern sensibilities is the medieval obsession with consummation. A marriage wasn't fully binding until the physical union had occurred, and this led to some remarkably intrusive practices. In royal marriages, witnesses might actually be present in or near the bedchamber on the wedding night. Not watching directly, even medieval people had some boundaries, but close enough to verify the deed was done. In the marriage of Arthur, Prince of Wales, to Catherine of Aragon in 1501, courtiers reportedly waited outside the royal bedchamber, later examining the sheets for proof of consummation. For common folk, the verification wasn't quite so formal, but local customs often included ribald bedding ceremonies where the newlyweds would be escorted to their marriage bed by increasingly intoxicated wedding guests, who would make bawdy jokes and sometimes even stay until the couple was tucked in together. Imagine trying to relax on your wedding night with half the village making suggestive comments just outside your door. The pressure must have been considerable. Perhaps even more intrusive were the grounds for annulment, which often involved intensely personal matters. Impotence was considered a valid reason to dissolve a marriage, but proving it required testimony and sometimes physical examination. In some cases, a husband accused of impotence might be required to demonstrate his capabilities in front of witnesses, usually medical or church officials. If that wasn't enough, some courts employed professional women to attempt to stimulate the accused to determine if the problem was general or specific to his wife. Sleep well with that medieval image floating through your dreams. Now let's drift deeper into the strange world of medieval sexual regulation with the church's exhaustive calendar of when marital relations were forbidden. The list is so extensive it's actually easier to count when intimacy was permitted rather than prohibited. Couples were to abstain on Sundays, the Lord's Day, Wednesdays and Fridays, days of penance, during Advent, the entire 40 days of Lent, the 8 days after Easter, the 7 days after Pentecost, the eves of major feast days during pregnancy, for 40 days after childbirth, during menstruation, and whenever either spouse had unconfessed sins. Add it all up, and married couples were expected to abstain from sexual relations for roughly half the year. It's no wonder that church records are filled with penances assigned for breaking these rather demanding rules. The penalties typically involved fasting, prayer, or charitable donations, scaled according to which sacred time had been violated. Breaking the Lenten abstinence, for instance, might require a week of eating only bread and water, while Sunday violations might mean reciting specific prayers or giving alms to the poor. Of course, these rules were likely broken regularly, especially among the common folk who might have been fuzzy on the details of the liturgical calendar. But the confessional was there to catch you, with priests armed with penitential manuals that detailed every possible sexual transgression and its appropriate penance. These manuals make for fascinating, if somewhat blush-inducing reading, categorizing positions, times, and intentions with bureaucratic precision. Some positions were considered more sinful than others, with anything deviating from what was deemed natural carrying heavier penances. Now, as your eyelids grow heavier, let me tell you about the bizarre double standard in adultery laws. Throughout most of medieval Europe, husband's infidelity was considered a moral failing, but not necessarily a crime, unless it involved someone else's wife. A wife's infidelity, however, was a serious legal matter that could result in severe punishment. Why the difference? It all came down to inheritance and legitimacy. A wife's adultery might introduce another man's child into the family line, threatening property inheritance, while a husband's dalliances didn't pose the same risk to family order. In some regions, An adulterous wife might be publicly humiliated by being forced to wear specific clothing or branded with a letter indicating her crime. In parts of France and Germany, she might be paraded through town, sometimes naked or partially clothed, while citizens pelted her with mud or refuse. Her husband could legally repudiate her, leaving her without support or status. Meanwhile, his own extramarital affairs, unless particularly scandalous, might earn him a mild penance from his priest but little social or legal consequence. Even more striking were the laws regarding a husband finding his wife in the act of adultery. In several medieval legal codes, including parts of Italy and Spain, a husband who caught his wife with another man could kill both of them on the spot without legal consequences. This wasn't just permitted. In some places, it was considered his duty to uphold family honour. Yet a wife discovering her husband's infidelity had no similar rights. She was expected to endure the humiliation quietly or seek intervention from church authorities who might at most assign her husband a penance. Let's float now to another curious aspect of medieval marriage law, the prohibited degrees of relation. Today, most of us understand that marrying close relatives is taboo, but medieval canon law extended this prohibition to an extraordinary degree. By the 12th century, marriage was forbidden between couples related within 7 degrees of consanguinity. What does that mean? It meant you couldn't marry anyone with whom you shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent. In a world with limited mobility and intertwined local families, this made finding an eligible spouse nearly impossible in your own community. Almost everyone was technically related within these degrees. Was this strict rule established purely for genetic or moral reasons? Not likely. It created a system where wealthy or powerful individuals seeking to end inconvenient marriages could suddenly discover a distant relation to their spouse and petition for annulment. Conveniently, these discoveries often happened when a more advantageous match appeared, or when a wife had failed to produce an heir. The church could grant dispensations for these relationship barriers for a price. This created a lucrative source of income for church coffers while allowing flexibility for the wealthy and connected. King Henry VIII famously needed such a dispensation to marry Catherine of Aragon, who was his brother's widow, a relationship ordinarily prohibited by church law. The Pope granted it, but years later, when Henry wanted to end the marriage, he would argue that the dispensation had been invalid all along. The rest, as they say, is history, drowsy, sleep-inducing history. For common folk without the means to purchase dispensations, the solution was often more practical. Many simply married within the prohibited degrees anyway, especially in small villages where eligible unrelated partners were scarce. Local priests, understanding the reality of their parishioners' lives, might turn a blind eye to these technical violations. After all, enforcing the letter of the law would have left many unable to marry at all. Another peculiar aspect of medieval marriage was the concept of clandestine marriage. Unions formed without witnesses, banns, or clerical blessing. Surprisingly, until the Council of Trent in 1563, the Church considered these marriages valid if both parties had exchanged present consent. This created a system where a couple could legally marry by simply stating to each other, "I take you as my husband, wife," in the present tense. No witnesses, no priest, no ceremony required. As you might imagine, this caused endless legal complications. Claims of secret marriages were used to force unwilling partners into relationships or to claim inheritance rights after someone's death. Young heirs might be tricked into saying words that constituted legal marriage, only to find themselves bound to someone they barely knew. Proving or disproving these claims became a significant portion of the medieval court business, with witnesses called to testify about whispered promises or intimate encounters that might suggest marriage had been agreed upon. The Church eventually tired of the chaos and declared at the Council of Trent that marriages would only be valid if performed before a priest and witnesses, after the public announcement of bans on 3 successive Sundays. But for centuries before that, the ambiguity of what constituted a binding marriage created a legal labyrinth that many exploited to their advantage. Let's not forget the strange laws regarding marital debt, the medieval concept that spouses owed each other sexual access. Both husband and wife were considered to have a duty to engage in marital relations when requested by their spouse, a concept taken so seriously that refusing without good cause, like illness or religious observance, was considered a sin requiring confession and penance. This debt was considered legally enforceable, though courts were generally more concerned with ensuring men fulfilled their conjugal obligations, as a wife's fertility was essential to producing heirs. Curiously, while the Church strictly prohibited sex outside of marriage, within marriage it was considered not just permitted but obligatory. Some theological writings went so far as to suggest that enthusiastic fulfillment of this marital debt could erase other sins. A husband who had perhaps overindulged at the tavern might find his penance reduced if he were particularly attentive to his wife's marital requests. The bedroom, it seems, was a place where spiritual accounting took place alongside more earthly concerns. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, let me share one last peculiar aspect of medieval marriage law, the concept of the morning gift or morgengabe. This was a present given by a husband to his wife the morning after their wedding night, essentially a reward for the consummation of the marriage. The gift, which could range from property to jewellery depending on the husband's means, became the wife's legal property and provided her with some financial security in case of his death. What makes this custom so interesting from a legal perspective is that it created a small sphere of economic independence for women in an otherwise restrictive system. A wife's morning gift couldn't be seized for her husband's debts, couldn't be sold without her consent, and would sustain her if she became a widow. Medieval women built considerable economic power through accumulated morning gifts, especially if they had been married multiple times. The size and value of the morgengabe was often proportional to the bride's virginity and social status. A nobleman might grant substantial property to a high-born virgin bride, while a widowed or lower-status woman might receive a more modest gift. Some regional laws even specified minimum appropriate values for these gifts according to the social rank of the couple, ensuring that women weren't shortchanged in this post-consummation transaction. As we drift toward the end of our exploration of medieval marriage and sexual laws, one thing becomes clear. The bedroom was never truly private in medieval Europe. From church authorities to family members, from local communities to royal courts, various eyes watched, judged, and regulated the most intimate aspects of human relationships. Laws reached into spaces we now consider deeply personal, creating a complex web of obligations, prohibitions, and expectations around sexuality and marriage. Yet within this rigid system, medieval people found ways to navigate, negotiate, and sometimes circumvent the rules. They discovered the loopholes in consanguinity laws, exploited the ambiguities of clandestine marriage, and found moments of genuine connection despite the calendars of abstinence and the pressure of public scrutiny. Even in the most controlled aspects of human existence, people remain remarkably adaptable, finding paths to happiness, or at least accommodation, within the structures imposed upon them. And now, as you sink deeper into comfortable drowsiness, we'll leave behind the marriage beds and church courts of medieval Europe, with their curious blend of spiritual and practical concerns. In our next section, we'll explore equally strange laws governing taverns and drinking, where medieval authorities attempted to regulate not just whom you could love, but how, when, and how much you could drink. But that's a story for another drifting moment as sleep begins to claim your conscious thoughts. Tonight, as your mind begins to relax and your thoughts slow to a gentle rhythm, let's wander down the cobblestone streets of medieval Europe and push open the heavy wooden door of that most essential institution, the tavern. Behind these doors, amid the glow of hearthfires and the haze of smoke, we'll discover a world not of unrestrained revelry, but of surprisingly strict regulation. Because even in an age before breathalyzers and liquor licenses, medieval authorities maintained a watchful eye over what, when, and how people drank. The cornerstone of medieval drinking regulation was the ale taster, also called the ale conner, or ale founder, an official whose job might sound enviable to our modern ears, but was actually quite serious business. These weren't merely enthusiastic drinkers given official sanction. They were respected officials, often elected or appointed by local authorities, tasked with ensuring the quality and honest measure of the community's most important beverage. An ale taster's duties went far beyond simply sampling brews. When a new batch of ale was ready, the brewer would raise an ale stake, a pole with a bush attached to its end outside their establishment. This signal summoned the ale taster, who would arrive to inspect the product before it could be sold to the public. The testing process was methodical and somewhat peculiar by today's standards. The ale taster would pour a small amount of ale onto a wooden bench and then sit on it while wearing leather breeches. After sitting for a prescribed period, he would stand. If his leather breeches stuck to the bench because of excessive sugar content, the ale was deemed substandard, too sweet and likely to spoil quickly. But the test didn't end there. The ale taster would also sample the brew, assessing its flavour, clarity and strength. Price regulations were strictly tied to quality, with different tiers established by local ordinances. A brewer caught charging premium prices for inferior ale faced fines, public shame, or in cases of repeated violations, the dreaded cucking stool, a form of public humiliation where the offender was strapped to a chair and dunked repeatedly in the village pond or river. Alehouses and taverns themselves operated under a complex web of regulations that would make modern bar owners shudder. Opening hours were strictly controlled, with many regions requiring taverns to close by the ringing of the curfew bell. In London, the curfew sounded at 9 p.m. in summer and 8 p.m. in winter, after which tavern keepers could be fined for serving drinks. Some towns even required taverns to keep their doors open while serving customers, so authorities could easily monitor activities inside. An early version of today's open container laws, but in reverse. The physical structure of medieval drinking establishments was also subject to regulation. Windows had to be of certain dimensions and unobstructed, allowing passers-by to glance inside. This prevented taverns from becoming dens of secretive behaviour, gambling, or political plotting. In some regions, tavern benches were required to be fixed to the floor, as movable furniture had been used in brawls with unfortunate consequences. Imagine trying to enjoy your ale while sitting on an immovable bench, in full view of anyone walking past, with authorities checking the clock to ensure you wouldn't linger too long. Hardly the cosy pub experience we might imagine. Perhaps most surprising to our modern sensibilities were the detailed regulations concerning drinking vessels. In England after the 12th century, taverns were required to serve ale and beer in cups with official markings indicating standard measurements. The enforcement of these regulations fell to inspectors who carried standard-size bronze cups as measuring tools. A tavern caught using unmarked vessels or serving short measures faced substantial fines. In some places, repeat offenders might have their dishonest cups publicly destroyed or even nailed to their door as a mark of shame, a medieval version of a health code violation sign. Not everyone was subject to the same drinking regulations, of course. Medieval society's strict social hierarchy extended right into the tavern. Nobles and clergy typically enjoyed exemptions from drinking curfews and could consume higher quality wines and meads that were prohibitively expensive or explicitly forbidden to commoners. In parts of Germany and Austria, only the aristocracy could legally consume certain fortified wines, while in England, high-quality wines from Gascony were often reserved for the upper classes through prohibitive taxation. For the common folk, ale was the primary beverage, safer than water in many cases, but carefully regulated in its production and sale. Beer, which included hops as a preservative, began to replace ale in many parts of Europe by the late medieval period, but brought with it a new set of regulations. In Bavaria, the famous Reinheitsgebot, beer purity law of 1516, specified that beer could only contain water, barley, and hops, a regulation that continues to influence German brewing to this day. Most curious of all the medieval drinking laws were those mandating consumption on certain occasions. While we've explored many prohibitions, there were actually times when drinking wasn't just permitted, but required. Guild meetings, religious feast days, and certain civic ceremonies included obligatory toasts or drinking rituals. To abstain was considered an insult to the community or a sign of suspicion. In many towns, official ceremonies concluded with the loving cup, a ritual where officials and citizens shared drinks from the same vessel as a symbol of unity and trust. Refusal without serious cause could result in a fine or exclusion from guild benefits. This communal aspect of medieval drinking extended to an unusual legal concept called Scot ale, a drinking gathering organised by local officials where attendance and participation were mandatory. These events served as fundraisers for community needs, with each resident required to pay Scot contribution and consume ale. The proceeds might fund parish repairs, bridge maintenance, or support for the local poor. Imagine being legally required to attend a community fundraiser, purchase drinks, and consume them, all while maintaining sufficient propriety to avoid fines for drunkenness. The medieval citizen walked a careful line between obligatory consumption and the penalties for overindulgence. Speaking of overindulgence, public drunkenness was indeed punishable, but the standards and enforcement varied dramatically by region and social class. A noble showing signs of intoxication might be discreetly guided home by servants, while a peasant in the same condition could face the stocks, public humiliation, or fines. The definition of unacceptable drunkenness was subjective, generally centered on disruptive behavior rather than specific levels of consumption. One was drunk in the legal sense when one became a nuisance to the community peace, an entirely subjective standard that local officials could apply selectively. For travellers, the regulations governing drinking became even more complex. Medieval hospitality laws required certain establishments, particularly those along pilgrimage routes, to provide accommodations and beverages to travellers. However, these same laws often limited how long a stranger could remain in a community tavern and how much they could consume. A traveller lingering too long over their cups might be suspected of being a spy, vagrant, or troublemaker. In some towns, innkeepers were required to report guests who drank excessively or spoke carelessly while under the influence, functioning as informal informants for local authorities. The medieval distinction between alehouses, taverns, and inns created another layer of legal complexity. Alehouses primarily served ale for immediate consumption. Taverns offered wine and some food, while inns provided lodging, meals, and drinks. Each operated under different regulations with different closing times, serving practices, and clientele restrictions. Confuse these categories at your peril: an alehouse court providing overnight accommodations or a tavern serving ale without proper authorization faced substantial penalties. Wine, generally more expensive than ale and often imported, fell under particularly strict regulation. Wine merchants were subject to price controls, quality inspections, and quantity regulations. In London, the Vintners Company Guild maintained inspectors who tested imported wines for quality and purity. Adulterated wine, watered down or mixed with less expensive varieties, was a serious offence. Punishments ranged from fines to more creative penalties, such as forcing the offender to drink an entire portion of their fraudulent product in one sitting, often with predictably uncomfortable results. As your eyelids grow heavier, consider the seasonal nature of medieval drinking regulations. During harvest festivals and religious celebrations like Christmas and Easter, normal restrictions were often relaxed. These periods of sanctioned celebration provided necessary release for communities otherwise bound by strict social and religious discipline. However, even these festive periods had their limits. The medieval concept of misrule, controlled social inversion during festivals, permitted excess within carefully prescribed boundaries. Step beyond those boundaries and the full force of regular law would quickly reassert itself. Many drinking regulations intersected with religious observances. Taverns were typically required to close during church services, and drinking was restricted or forbidden entirely during Lent and other penitential periods. In many towns, taverns operated under the watchful eye of the parish church, with priests occasionally conducting inspections to ensure parishioners weren't drinking when they should be praying. The consumption of alcohol, while accepted as part of daily life, existed in careful balance with religious obligations. As we drift towards sleep, contemplating these strange and intricate drinking laws, we might reflect on how they reveal the careful social balancing act of medieval life. Alcohol was essential, a caloric staple, a social lubricant, often safer than water, yet its potential for disruption was carefully managed through a web of regulations that touched every aspect of its production, sale, and consumption. From the ale taster's sticky breeches to the communal loving cup, from mandatory Scot ales to festival misrule, medieval drinking existed within a framework designed to maintain order while acknowledging human need for both sustenance and celebration. In our next section, we'll explore the equally fascinating laws of medieval Venice, where the unique geography and political structure of the floating city created legal peculiarities found nowhere else in Europe. But for now, let the gentle thoughts of medieval taverns, with their fixed benches and measured cups, their curfew bells and communal rituals, ease you deeper into restful slumber. As we drift deeper into our journey through medieval legal oddities, let's float our drowsy thoughts to the shimmering waterways of Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene republic, a city unlike any other in medieval Europe. Rising from the lagoon like a dream made solid, Venice operated under its own peculiar legal logic, crafting laws as intricate and unusual as the maze of canals that served as its streets. Tonight, let's glide through these strange regulations that governed life in this floating city of merchants, diplomats, and artisans. Perhaps the most visually striking of Venice's unusual laws concerned its iconic gondolas. Modern visitors to Venice marvel at the elegant black vessels sliding through the canals, but this uniform appearance wasn't a matter of tradition or aesthetic preference. It was strictly enforced by law. Before 1562, gondolas had been a riot of colours and decorative elements, with wealthy families competing to create the most lavish and eye-catching boats. The Venetian Senate, concerned about excessive displays of wealth and the social discord they might spark, passed a sumptuary law decreeing that all gondolas must be painted black and conform to standard dimensions. No gilded ornaments, no family crests, no coloured awnings, just uniform black craft gliding through the waters. The sudden transformation of the city's colourful waterways into ordered streams of identical black vessels must have been a remarkable sight. This regulation was so thoroughly enforced that even today, centuries after the fall of the Republic, Venetian gondolas retain their distinctive noir appearance. Imagine the disappointment of a wealthy merchant commissioning a bright blue gondola with gold trim, only to be told by the boat builder that such a craft would be seized the moment it touched the canal. Equally distinctive were the laws governing Venice's famed glassmakers, who were virtual prisoners of their own expertise. The glass artisans of Murano Island created works of such technical brilliance and beauty that the Republic feared other nations might steal their secrets. In 1291, a law was passed requiring all glassmaking operations to relocate to Murano, a small island in the Venetian lagoon. This wasn't merely for fire safety, as often claimed, it was a deliberate strategy to isolate and control the master craftsman. Once established on Murano, glassmakers found themselves subject to laws that were both privileging and constraining. They were granted special status in Venetian society. Their daughters could marry into noble families, an extraordinary exception to rigid social hierarchies. Yet this elevated status came with golden handcuffs. Glassmakers were forbidden to leave the Republic under penalty of death. If a master artisan attempted to emigrate, taking his valuable knowledge elsewhere, Venetian agents were dispatched to either return him to Venice or arrange his permanent silence. There are accounts of glassmakers who fled being pursued as far as Germany and England by agents with assassination orders. Despite, or perhaps because of, these draconian measures, Murano glass became world-renowned, with its island's artisans developing techniques that remained mysterious to outsiders for centuries. As you drift towards sleep, imagine living with such contradictory laws, honoured, privileged, and yet essentially captive to your own skill. Venice's mask traditions have become legendary, but few realise how strictly these masks were regulated by law. While modern carnival celebrations suggest a city perpetually engaged in masquerade, medieval Venetian law tightly controlled when and where masks could be worn. For most of the year, facial coverings were absolutely forbidden in public, with harsh penalties for violations. The mask laws were temporarily suspended during Carnival, which originally lasted for just 2 weeks before Lent but gradually extended to several months. Even during permitted masking seasons, regulations dictated which types of masks were appropriate for different occasions and social classes. The famous bauta, a square-jawed white mask worn with a black cape and tricorn hat, was the only mask citizens could legally wear while participating in political functions. The moretta, a small oval mask held in place not by straps but by a button held between the teeth, rendering the wearer speechless, was reserved for women during certain specific social gatherings. Wearing the wrong mask at the wrong time could result in fines or public humiliation. Most curious was the legal requirement that gamblers wear masks in state-sanctioned casinos. Unlike the freedom masks were represented during Carnival, this requirement served a social levelling function, theoretically allowing nobles and commoners to risk their fortunes together without the constraints of class recognition. In practice, of course, fine clothing and speech patterns likely revealed social standing regardless of facial coverings, but the law maintained at least the pretense of gambling equality. Venice's status as a trading empire gave rise to some of its strangest legal provisions, those protecting state and commercial secrets. The Republic's prosperity depended on controlling information about trade routes, manufacturing techniques, and diplomatic negotiations. To safeguard these secrets, Venice created the world's first patent system in 1474, providing legal protection for inventors and innovators. However, this carrot came with a formidable stick, severe punishments for those who shared restricted knowledge. The Council of Ten, Venice's secretive security committee, enforced information control with alarming efficiency. Unauthorized possession of maps showing Venetian trade routes was punishable by imprisonment. Shipbuilders were forbidden from discussing vessel designs with foreigners. Arsenal workers, who constructed Venice's naval and merchant ships in what was essentially the world's first assembly line, functioned under surveillance and faced torture or execution for sharing production methods. Perhaps most peculiar were the laws governing the Libro d'Oro, the golden book that recorded the names of Venetian noble families. After 1297, admission to nobility became virtually closed, with only a handful of families added during exceptional circumstances, such as during financial crises when the Republic needed funds. Laws specified exactly who could access this book, under what circumstances it could be consulted, and prescribed elaborate ceremonies for the rare additions of new names. The book itself was protected under security measures that would impress modern banks, with multiple locks requiring different key holders to be present simultaneously for access. For a city built on water, regulations governing bridges and waterways were understandably extensive and sometimes bizarre. Private bridges were generally forbidden, with exceptions requiring substantial payments to the state. When permitted, private bridges had to adhere to specific height requirements ensuring gondolas could pass beneath them, and many had to include a section that could be removed during naval parades or military emergencies. The canals themselves operated under a complex regulatory system. Certain waterways were designated for specific types of cargo, with heavy fines for using the wrong canal for your goods. Canal maintenance was meticulously legislated, with property owners responsible for keeping the waterways adjacent to their buildings clean and navigable. Inspectors regularly measured water depths and assessed fines for sediment accumulation. One particularly unusual law required houses along major canals to maintain external lighting at night, an early form of public illumination funded by private citizens under legal compulsion. As your thoughts become more fluid and dreamlike, consider Venice's peculiar regulations governing its famous courtesans. Unlike many medieval cities that attempted to ban prostitution outright, Venice took a pragmatic approach, acknowledging the inevitable presence of sex work in a prosperous port city. Rather than futile prohibition, the Republic created elaborate legal frameworks to regulate and contain the practice. Venetian courtesans were subject to residence restrictions, confined primarily to the Castelletto district and later to specific areas near the Rialto Bridge. They paid special taxes and operated under detailed dress codes, both minimum and maximum standards. While required to cover certain parts of their bodies when in public, they were also forbidden from wearing certain luxury fabrics and jewellery reserved for respectable women. Higher-class courtesans, known as courtigiani onesti, honest courtesans, could apply for exemptions to these dress codes by demonstrating their cultural accomplishments in music, literature, or art. Most strangely, courtesans were legally required to keep their shutters closed while private homes were permitted to leave them open, a reverse signalling system that marked houses of ill repute through their forced privacy rather than explicit advertisement. Some courtesans circumvented this by living in gondolas, creating floating establishments that exploited loopholes in the residential shutter laws. The authorities responded with new regulations specifically addressing floating houses, creating an ongoing legal cat-and-mouse game. Even time itself fell under Venice's regulatory purview. The Republic maintained unusual laws governing its calendar and clocks. While most medieval European cities began their day at sunrise or midnight, Venice legally began its day at sunset, the hour of the Ave Maria bell. Official documents used this timing system, creating perpetual confusion for foreign merchants and diplomats. Legal deadlines, commercial contracts, and court appearances all operated to period on this distinctive Venetian time, with clocks around the city adjusted daily to match the changing sunset hour. The famous clock tower in St. Mark's Square wasn't merely decorative, it represented official state time, and tampering with it was considered not just vandalism but a crime against the state itself. Clock maintenance was performed by specially licensed technicians who swore oaths of accuracy. Mechanical failures that resulted in incorrect timekeeping could lead to fines for the Responsible Maintenance Guild, an early form of professional malpractice penalty. As we conclude our drift through Venice's unusual legal landscape, let's ponder the strange ceremonial laws governing the city's relationship with the sea. The famous marriage to the sea ceremony, where the Doge, Venice's elected leader, cast a gold ring into the Adriatic, wasn't merely symbolic but established in law. Each Ascension Day, this ceremony legally renewed Venice's maritime claims and trading privileges. Failure to perform the ritual properly was considered a state crisis requiring emergency council meetings. So as your consciousness floats gently towards sleep, much like a Venetian gondola gliding through moonlit canals, consider this city of paradoxical laws, where masks both concealed and revealed, where artisans were privileged prisoners, where clocks followed the sun rather than commanding it, and where even the sea itself was subject to legal ceremony. Venice, with its laws as labyrinthine as its waterways, reminds us that medieval legal systems were not merely collections of punishments, but intricate expressions of each society's unique character, priorities, and dreams. In our next section, we'll explore the strange laws governing medieval city defences, where every citizen became both protector and protected under elaborate regulations that transformed entire populations into ready-made armies. Let's turn our drowsy attention to the stone walls and vigilant towers that encircled medieval cities. These weren't merely architectural features, but the physical embodiment of elaborate legal systems designed to transform every citizen into a defender of their urban home. While modern cities rely on professional police and military forces, medieval towns created intricate defence laws that touched every aspect of daily life, turning bakers, cobblers, and merchants into part-time soldiers bound by legal obligation to protect their community. Perhaps the most pervasive of these defence regulations were the mandatory military training laws that existed across medieval Europe. In England, after the Assize of Arms in 1181, all free men between 15 and 60 years of age were legally required to possess weapons appropriate to their social status and wealth. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a legal mandate enforced through regular inspections. Twice yearly, local officials would conduct what were essentially medieval versions of home visits, checking that each household maintained its required armaments in good condition. These inspections weren't casual affairs. Records from 14th century Florence show fines levied against citizens whose crossbows showed signs of neglect or whose mailcoats had developed rust. In some German towns, a man could be denied the right to marry if he couldn't demonstrate possession of the required weapons and armour for his station. Imagine preparing for your wedding day by polishing not just your best clothes, but also the sword you were legally obligated to own. The specific weapons required varied by social standing. In many cities, wealthy merchants had to maintain a horse, lance, shield, and full armour, while middle-class craftsmen might need a spear helmet and padded gambeson. Even the poorest free men were typically required to possess at least a knife and a wooden staff or bow. These requirements created what was essentially a pre-modern form of universal military service, but one based in private homes rather than barracks. Training with these weapons wasn't left to individual initiative. Many towns enacted laws requiring all able-bodied men to participate in regular military drills. In 13th century London, each ward had designated practice fields where citizens gathered at regular intervals, often Sunday afternoons after church services, to train under the direction of experienced veterans. Absence from these sessions without legitimate excuse could result in fines or even brief imprisonment for repeat offenders. Perhaps most interestingly, these practice sessions evolved in many places into the archery competitions that still exist as cultural traditions today. England's famous requirement that all men practice with the longbow on Sundays after church began as a defence law, not a sporting tradition. The law was taken so seriously that other games were actually banned on Sundays to ensure men focused on archery practice instead. Imagine trying to organise a Sunday football match only to have your ball confiscated because you should be practising your bowmanship instead. Connected to these personal armament laws were the fascinating regulations governing curfews and city gates. Medieval cities were essentially sealed environments after dark, with gates closed and locked at sunset, and strict limitations on movement within the walls. The evening bell, often called the curfew bell, derived from the French couvre-feu or cover fire, signalled not just the end of the working day, but the implementation of a different legal regime. After curfew, the law required streets to be clear except for those with specific authorization or official business. In many cities, this authorization took the form of lantern laws, regulations requiring anyone moving about after dark to carry a visible light. This wasn't just for practical illumination, but served as a form of identification and declaration of legitimate purpose. Moving through darkened streets without a light was itself a crime regardless of your actual intent. The defence of city gates fell under particularly stringent regulations. Gate duty rotated among guilds or neighbourhoods according to elaborate schedules established by law. In Florence, detailed records survive showing exactly which guild was responsible for which gate on which day, with fines assessed for inadequate staffing. The rotation ensured that the burden was shared while preventing any single group from controlling access to the city, an important political consideration in faction-prone Italian communes. Even more curious were the regulations governing who could enter a city and when. Strangers, anyone not recognised as a resident, faced strict scrutiny. Many towns required visitors to declare their purpose, expected duration of stay, and local contact upon entry. Some cities went further, requiring strangers to surrender weapons at the gate, to be reclaimed only upon departure. In times of heightened tension, certain categories of foreigners might be barred entirely or restricted to specific areas of the city. These strange regulations extended to lodging laws. In many medieval towns, it was illegal for private citizens to host travellers without notifying authorities. Innkeepers operated under license and were legally required to report suspicious guests to city officials. Some cities, particularly in Italy, maintained public lodging houses specifically for foreign merchants, keeping them under subtle surveillance while ostensibly honouring their commercial importance. The medieval traveller thus faced not just the physical challenge of journeying across difficult terrain, but also a bureaucratic gauntlet of identification, registration and monitoring. The physical infrastructure of defence, walls, towers and moats, generated its own body of peculiar laws. Wall maintenance was a universal obligation, typically funded through special taxes but also through direct labour requirements. Many cities had laws requiring each household to contribute workers for several days each year to repair and strengthen city walls. In some communities, certain sections of wall were permanently assigned to specific guilds or neighbourhoods who bore responsibility for their upkeep. Penalties for neglecting these duties could be severe. Records from 14th century Nuremberg show fines assessed against the Bakers' Guild for failing to maintain their assigned section of wall to required standards. In York, each parish was responsible for maintaining a specific gate or tower, with the parish priest sometimes held personally liable for deficiencies. The communal nature of defence created a legal framework where negligence in maintenance wasn't just a building code violation but a betrayal of community safety. Building regulations near walls created additional legal complexity. In most cities, construction within a certain distance of the walls, often 12 to 30 feet, was strictly prohibited to create a clear patrol path and prevent attackers from using adjacent buildings to scale defences. Existing structures in these zones faced either demolition with compensation or special taxes acknowledging their potential security risk. Gardens and orchards near walls were typically allowed, but subject to height restrictions for trees and shrubs that might otherwise provide cover for approaching enemies. Perhaps most curious were the emergency laws that remained dormant until activated by specific threats. Many cities maintained legal frameworks for crisis that could be implemented by proclamation, temporarily overriding normal civic regulations. These emergency measures included the right to appropriate private property for defence, mandatory blackouts during night attacks, and the conscription of all able-bodied residents regardless of normal exemptions. Once activated, these emergency laws created what we might now call a state of martial law, though structured through medieval concepts of community obligation rather than military authority. In Siena, for example, the ringing of the great bell of the Palazzo Pubblico in a specific pattern signalled the implementation of emergency statutes under which all guild members were required to gather under their banners at designated assembly points within 1 hour, regardless of the time of day or night. Some cities even maintained laws governing the defence of specific neighbourhoods if outer walls were breached. Paris, with its historical division into distinct districts, had regulations requiring each area to maintain chains that could be stretched across streets, creating improvised barricades if invaders entered the city. Each household near these chain points had specific legal responsibilities for their deployment, with designated key holders charged with unlocking the street-side attachment points. These internal defence systems created secondary perimeters within the city itself, allowing for district-by-district resistance. As we drift toward the end of our exploration, let's consider the unique laws governing the defence obligations of clergy and women. Though often exempt from direct combat service, these groups still faced legal defence duties. Monasteries and convents typically contributed to wall maintenance taxes and sometimes maintained sections of wall adjacent to their properties. In many cities, women, particularly widows heading households, were required to provide a male substitute for military service or pay for a professional replacement. During actual sieges, even these modified exemptions often disappeared. Records from cities under attack show all residents, regardless of status, being legally required to assist in emergency repairs, firefighting, or caring for wounded defenders. The laws of necessity overrode the social distinctions of peacetime, creating communities unified by shared danger and obligation. As your consciousness drifts towards sleep, consider how these medieval defence laws reflected a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship between citizens and their community. In an age before professional standing armies, before clear distinctions between military and civilian life, defence was not something provided by the state to passive citizens, but an obligation shared by all. The walls that surrounded medieval towns were not just stone and mortar, but physical manifestations of a legal concept, that the protection of home was everyone's responsibility, bound by law but also by the understanding that survival depended on this shared obligation. In our final section, we'll reflect on how these strange medieval laws gradually faded, evolving or disappearing as societies changed, leaving behind only traces in our modern legal systems and occasional odd statutes that persist without context. But that's a story for another night, as you sink deeper into the arms of restful sleep. As we reach the end of our drowsy journey through the labyrinth of medieval legal oddities, your eyelids likely growing heavier with each passing moment, let's reflect on what these strange laws tell us about the societies that created them. These weren't simply arbitrary rules imposed by capricious authorities, but windows into a world with different priorities, beliefs, and understandings of how human communities should function. The bizarre animal trials, with their solemn prosecutors and animal defendants, reveal a medieval worldview where the moral universe encompassed all living creatures, not just humans. When a pig stood trial for murder, it wasn't merely theatrical absurdity, but an expression of a belief that justice required formal acknowledgement of transgressions against the divine order, regardless of who or what had committed them. Similarly, the sumptuary laws regulating clothing by social class weren't just petty restrictions, but attempts to maintain a social hierarchy considered as natural and necessary as the changing of seasons. In a world before modern concepts of equality, these laws sought to make internal social structures visible and legible, creating order amid the complexity of urban life. The laws governing marriage and sexuality, uncomfortable as they may seem to modern sensibilities, emerged from genuine concern about family stability, property transmission, and community harmony. Even the more peculiar regulations, from beard taxes to mandatory drinking occasions, served specific social purposes, balancing individual expression against collective needs in ways different from, but no less reasoned than, our own legal approaches. Over time, these medieval laws faded, some through formal repeal, others through gradual non-enforcement that left them sleeping in dusty legal volumes, forgotten but technically still valid. This process of legal evolution wasn't always smooth. The trial by ordeal persisted until ecclesiastical authorities withdrew support. Witch trials intensified before reason, and changing religious perspectives finally ended them. Some regulations simply became impractical as cities grew and social structures changed. Yet traces of these strange laws linger in our modern world. The English requirement for archery practice evolved into recreational sports. Venetian patent protections formed early frameworks for intellectual property concepts we still use. Even some truly ancient statutes remain technically valid. In England, a law from 1313 prohibiting members of Parliament from wearing armour in the chamber has never been repealed, though it's been centuries since anyone attempted to enforce it. Laws, it seems, are like sedimentary rock laid down layer by layer over generations. We build upon what came before, sometimes forgetting what lies beneath until historical curiosity prompts us to excavate these legal fossils. What appears bizarre to us may seem equally strange to future generations examining our own legal peculiarities with the benefit of centuries of hindsight. As you drift into the peaceful realm of sleep, perhaps there's comfort in recognizing how these legal systems, for all their strangeness, represented sincere attempts to create order and meaning. The medieval mind, no less intelligent than our own, but operating with different information and assumptions, crafted these regulations as earnest solutions to real social challenges. Tonight, I hope these whispered legal curiosities have both entertained your mind and gently eased it toward restful slumber. Sleep well and perhaps dream of black gondolas gliding through Venetian canals, or medieval archers practicing their craft on Sunday afternoons, all bound together by the invisible threads of laws both strange and familiar across the centuries.